Welcome to Actual Spinster. For today's video I thought I would kind of like in honour of LGBT plus History Month in the UK, which is February this month, and also just because I've been thinking like about queer history, I guess a bit recently, I thought I would talk about my recommendations around queer history, like fiction, non-fiction. But this isn't just me talking about like historical fiction that includes queer people. It's about like the things that I chose are, well, they have to be like to some degree self-conscious about both queerness and history. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I wanted to choose things that maybe muddy like conventional understandings of time, which I do think is like part of a queer history approach, I guess. And also another aspect is things that maybe engage with like different and developing like ways of like stratifying different ways of being, or like queers, and so like, you know, thinking about kind of like not in any depth, but thinking about things like sexology and that's effect on like queer identity and understandings of like queer and trans people and their bodies and things like that. So like, yeah, I guess like I would just say a self-consciousness about history and queer and trans people within it is the vibe. So I'm going to start with non-fiction, which I don't have that many, but the first one is actually a book that I think I maybe talked about literally like 4 years ago now, and that's The Gentrification of the Mind, Witness to a Lost Imagination by Sarah Schulman, which, like, I don't think that this is like necessarily like a historical text in the way that like maybe some of the others that I could mention on this list are, but like I also think the way that it deals with AIDS is like very important, and the AIDS crisis was like obviously this like watershed moment for a lot of queer history in the late like 20th century, and it has an ongoing effect, you know, till now. Because I guess what this book does to some degree, obviously I haven't read it in a while, so this is maybe more vague than when I previously talked about it, but I think it engages with like what, like the question of what would have happened if AIDS hadn't happened, or like the devastating deaths of so many people, like what that would have looked like. And Schulman argues that like its effect on art is that with the death of many like gay artists, like a kind of gentrification of the mind has like come into art and artistic practice. Yeah, I don't know, like I feel like I'm doing a really bad job at talking about this, but I think it's an incredible book and I definitely would recommend it. As well as listening to the voices of people who are dead, I think it's also important to listen to people who did actually like live through it and still are living today. And obviously like Sarah Schulman has written like an ACT UP history, which I haven't read yet, and that is obviously much more of like a conventional history than what I would say this is. But yeah, I just think it's like really good. It is really good. It's got the MA History person seal of approval.
Yeah. Oh wait, I also read it.
Yeah. I also thought I would like include this on the list, but hopefully I'll talk about it briefly. These are like the selected love letters of Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West. And the reason I would put it on this list is because what's really funny about it is that like at various times throughout these letters, like Virginia Woolf will say something like, "You and your like saphists," to Vita Sackville West, as if like Virginia Woolf isn't herself like queer and falling in love with Vita Sackville West, who is, if she's a sapphist, then maybe Virginia might be one too. And obviously part of that as well is like I think Virginia Woolf has like a contempt for like these like sexological categories that are like being used at the time. And I read like a really great like article about that actually, which I will try and remember and put in the description box if I can find it. It was about like Mrs. Dalloway being like antagonistic to those kinds of categories. So like obviously I understand like not wanting to be categorized, but yeah, I just think it's very funny. And like at some points as well, they're like you get Vita's letters to Harold, her husband, and occasionally she'll be like, "Well, I'm not in love with Virginia, like don't worry," when I think it's like pretty obvious that she is. So yeah, I think that's very enjoyable to read like as a queer person. And obviously it is also like self-conscious about history in the sense of like literary history specifically, because they do talk about like these like big moments in like the 1920s especially, so like around like the banning of the Well of Loneliness and stuff like that, so that's all very interesting too. My last non-fiction choice is obviously a book I've talked about like a lot, or I feel like a lot, maybe I actually haven't talked about it that much, but it's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Hartman, which is an incredible kind of like seance of history. And whilst not everybody in the book is queer, I do think the majority of people it's about, and like definitely also the perspective on history, is like a black queer one, and yeah, it's just like brilliant. So it's specifically, I think it's it's like, it's specifically about, well, me and my American geography are not doing well here. It focuses on like Philadelphia and also New York. I think. From about like the 1890s, I want to say, into like the 1930s. And yeah, it kind of like looks at a variety of individuals, a lot of whom are women as well. Like I would say, you know, obviously again with like the categorization of certain people, like maybe if they had access to the same kinds of labels that we do today, they might categorize themselves differently, but like generally it's about queer black women in history, and in American history specifically, and it's about freedom and love and care, and it's also about like anti-work but also beauty and survival. And it's just like, it's very difficult to some degree because it does engage a lot with violence, but it's also just like so deeply inspiring and beautiful and very anarchic and collective. I guess I'm like speaking both about the people included in the book and also the book itself. It's just, yeah, like amazing, an incredible work, and I think like probably one of like the best queer history books that I've ever read, and I feel like I ever will read. And I think that's great, like that's not a bad thing at all. I'm going to move on to the fiction recommendations now. The first book is actually a book I talked about recently, which is Confessions of the Fox by Geordie Rosenberg. But I wanted to include it on this list because I think the self-consciousness about history is like very present in there. And it's about queer and trans people, but it is also specifically, it has this like trans focus, which is nice. So the book has, it's like two narratives kind of, but they're like intertwined, and so, what?
You said two narratives.
The book has two narratives happening, but they're like intertwined. So like there's this academic, is the academic called Jack? I really cannot remember, but anyway, like this academic finds a manuscript from the, it's from the 18th century, and it's a manuscript about the life of this thief, this like prison abolitionist revolutionary and woman lover who is called Jack, right? Gosh, I think so. I feel like I didn't really talk about this much on my channel because I read it at the end of like 2020 or something, so I only just included it in my like fave books of the year, but I didn't really like actually talk about the book. And yeah, like the book itself is like full of like a lot of things. Like it's quite kind of, it's almost fabulous, like it's almost like a Marxist fairy tale in a way, but it's quite like gritty. It's great, and I think it also really engages with like the idea of an archive, which also Wayward does too. I probably should have said that, in like a really material way, and thinking about the archive as, yeah, I definitely feel like I have said this about it before, but like thinking about the archive as both this like very vibrant and like fertile space, and also as like a deeply like repressive and closed and conservative one, and how like obviously like we need archives to some degree, but archives themselves can just be part of enacting violence onto history, onto people. I guess it's kind of hard to like hold archives accountable for that. Like obviously it's maybe easier to hold like archivists, but like the archive itself, and I think that is also partially what Wayward Life's Beautiful Experiments, Confessions of the Fox, and also maybe some others of the books I'm going to mention like sort of deal with. But yeah, I think Confessions of the Fox is like a really fun book. It's one of those books that I feel like people describe as a romp, and I would agree. It's yeah, it's great. Obviously I did have to talk about Load by Charlotte von Reinhold. I will try and speak briefly about it, but it's about this character called Matilda, and she's like living her life, trying to kind of exist and find beauty, and she gets like obsessed with these like transfictions, some of whom include like people from the Bright Young Things, and also like I think there's like, you know, composers and specific forms of art, and one of the ones that she gets obsessed with is this poet, this black modernist poet called Hermia Druitt, and it's about her search to figure out more about her life. And yeah, it's told in a, I don't think it's fragmented actually, but it's told in multiple different formats, I guess. Like we get like snippets from different books and things like that, which is a really fun process of the story, and I do think it's also like a way that this is very like archival in that respect. Like it has an aesthetics of the archive, and it's just brilliant, and you should read it. And I think it does really engage with a lot of what Confessions of the Fox is doing, and it also really does engage with a lot of what Wayward Life's Beautiful Experiments, like black survival and queer blackness and angels and breathing life into people who are dead or who have been like made dead by like epistemological violence. Did I use that word correctly? We'll never know. The next book is Plain Bad Heroines, which I do think is like a little bit more in the historical fiction without the self-consciousness vein, but because it has a double narrative as well, where we have like modern day stuff happening and past stuff happening, it also has that kind of vibe. It is also a horror book, and yeah, like it's definitely, like I would also say this is a romp, but in a different way, in a kind of like slightly more macabre, and like, I don't know, like it's just fun. So it follows these schoolgirls in 1902 in Rhode Island, and two of them die by like yellow jackets stinging, and they were in love with each other. Clara and Flo, I believe what they were called, and like their demises kind of like affect the school, and we kind of see that, the ricochet of that effect. Mary MacLane's memoir I Await the Devil's Coming, like that's also part of the story, like a lot, which is also this like real queer book that was, you know, infamous at the time, and also created the way that people, like queer people, talk about themselves and their beings and stuff. And then the modern day storyline is these mostly queer women are like making a horror film, and of that we're like going through the motions with them and like seeing what filming is like. And yeah, it's just like, it's a lot of fun. Like the school was called Brookhorns, but it's spelt like, it shouldn't be pronounced that way, it's just spelt H-A-N-T-S, but you get told early on in a footnote that like you have to pronounce it Brookhorns because that's how the guy who's made its last name was pronounced. Like all of this like fun, like I don't know, just like almost like just pleasure in how it's told, in how it's like playing around with horror and queerness, and I guess specifically like sapphic characters and love and experiences. A book that like I wasn't sure if I wanted to include on this list, but I did decide to do so anyway, was The Gilder Stories by Jill Gomez, which is about a vampire, a black lesbian vampire called Gilder, who travels through time, starting in 1850s Louisiana and ending in like post-2020. Like to some degree I feel like it plays like kind of like fast and loose with historical frameworks, because we get like only a fairly short amount of time in each kind of different era that we land in, but I also kind of felt like that's, I guess, part of this like queer history idea that I'm like tracing in this video, like in the sense that there's a very like intentional writing into the 1920s, for example, or the 1950s or the 1890s or whatever, like writing into those time periods of queerness and queer life, and I think that's like nice and important. And obviously it's sort of silly to say this, but obviously queer people have always existed, and like I guess this is like a nice kind of homage to that, and it's got vampires. So then I wanted to talk about this book that I read recently, When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Niveau, and it's like a very short book. It's just a little novella. It's about like a cleric called Chi, and so basically the thing is I haven't read the first book in this series because I thought this was the first book in the series, so whatever, but like I think they're just like separate but in a series, so it was okay. Yeah, so this cleric, they are like travelling around, and they basically get stopped by 3 tiger women who want to eat them, and they're like companion. As a way to like waylay the tiger women from eating them, they like tell the story of this famous like tiger woman and her scholar lover, and it's really lovely. And I think the self-consciousness here comes through like in how, and to some degree like the violence of the archive. Like I do think this book doesn't engage in particular depths with a lot of what it's like putting down, partially because of the length, and also because like it's not necessarily trying to like plumb the depths of what archiving or like collecting oral history is like, and that's fine. But yeah, so you get these, you get the story of Chi, the cleric, their experience in the like moment that they're interacting with these tiger women, and you also get the story of the scholar and the tiger woman in the past. But then you also get like intrusions into the narrative by the 3 different tiger women who are listening to the story, and you get their like retellings or like their corrections of the narrative. Yeah, so there's this like really interesting, like whose story is true, it's not clear, but the tiger women also are very like insistent on the fact that their story is the correct one, and they want Chi to like write it down and deliver it to where they like store their archive, which is like the Singing Hills or something like that. So yeah, it's like very interesting, it's like quite fun, it's very sexy and gay, and like I really enjoyed it. Wow, I didn't even call Plain Bad Heroine sexy, but like it's very sexy. The last fiction book I wanted to talk about was Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters, which I have previously said is one of my favourite books of all time, and that is definitely still true. I think like considering when this book was published, it's like from the 90s, and so like the Gilder stories was also published in the 90s, so there was clearly like this like moment then for like queer histories, or like bringing queer people to the front of historical narratives. Was that when like Pat Barker's gay World War I trilogy was published too? I think it was. So like I do think that there was some kind of like almost like reckoning with that going on. So obviously Sarah Waters isn't the only one who's doing it, but I do think that Tipping the Velvet is a really great example of that. I love the enthusiasm with which we're given like dykes of the past, and the pleasure-seeking orientated like narrative and main character, and it's a very sensory book, and it's also like weighted in like material, which I really liked, so you learn quite a lot about cross-dressing, stage performance and things like that, and blah blah blah, but like it's just great fun, and like it's in the same vein as like Romp. This obviously isn't an exhaustive list, and like I do have a lot of reading that I want to do of queer history, but yeah, that's just like some things that may be interesting, and I hope you have a nice LGBT plus history month, and hopefully I will convince the resident queer history expert to film a video with me and recommend some of her favourite like queer history related things too. So maybe we'll see you then. Bye!